Ashe County Oral History Project, an interview with Fred Colvard. Interviewer Bob McNeil, April 7th, 1981.
I'd just like to say in the beginning that I've known Mr. Colvard for over 50 years, and during that time I've had the utmost respect for him as a patriot, a humanitarian, and a farmer. He's meant much to the economy of Ashe County. Mr. Fred, what is your full name?
Fred Neil Colvard. You get it?
Yes, sir. Fred Neil Colvard.
Yeah.
And your wife's full name?
Zora Alice.
Zora Alice. Now, she was a
Williams.
Right. When and where were you born, Mr. Fred?
I was born here on this place.
Here on this place. In what year?
March the 19th, 1896.
Well, that's kind of a coincidence. You have the same birthday as my son.
Is that right?
Of course, a lot of years later, but March the 19th. That's very interesting. What were your parents' names, Mr. Fred?
My father was Christopher Columbus Colvard, C.C.
C.C. Colvard. Okay, would you mind to tell me something about your childhood days, some of the things you did, maybe how you celebrated Christmas back in those days, or?
Well, we didn't have much to celebrate with like they have now.
It wasn't as commercial, was it?
No. We had Christmas, and always a little from Santa Claus, but not like the children get nowadays.
Well, I know your father was like my father when he was with us. He always did as much as he could afford to.
That's right.
And I think that's typical of our mountain heritage. We always do as much as we can afford to do for our children.
That's like the old fellow told me down in Wilkes. No, what it once. I believe not Wilkes, but I believe it's down at well, I'd taken a load of seed potatoes down the country. And this old gentleman found out I was from up here. And he said, I go up to Boone every summer and stay a little while. And I have a friend about my age. He was an old man then, I was young, who thinks if he doesn't go, why, up in that country, for the summer, he just lost everything. And he says, you have the finest people up there in the world. They're friendly and nice to you. Have plenty. But says they have sense enough not to want much.
Well, that's putting it pretty good.
Yeah.
Mr. Fred, back when you were growing up, how many months of school did they have?
4 months.
4 months.
4 months.
And you, what kind of transportation did you have to school? On your foot? Okay.
Walked. Everybody walked.
And
even from, we had folks who walked from over on Beaver Creek.
right.
John McNeil's children came to school here. And they didn't miss much either. Snow be deep, you know, but they'd be there.
I've always heard it say that the winters back in those days were worse than they are here now. Is that right?
That's right. We had a lot more cold weather, starting about 1886. I have an old clipping down there somewhere at the office. Captain Dent was keeping the thermometer over here, and he said for the first week in January of that year, the thermometer ran from 9 to 29 below zero.
9 to 29. How about that? Well, what is the worst winter you can remember weather-wise?
Weather-wise, I guess the coldest weather-wise was the winter of 1718. It started in December 17.
Is that about the time you went in the service?
Yeah, I was in service then. I was up home during the time of it, but it got to 21 below that time.
Right. I've heard it say that was a bad year.
Bad year.
Mr. Colvard, when you were growing up, what was your ratio of work to play back in those days?
Ratio of work to play? Well, I guess about, we worked, we all had to work. About 50-50
About 50-50.
when I was young.
That's
Mhm.
good for a young person. They should have that much time
Yeah, they should.
for recreation. How hard was it to get a doctor back in those days if you had sickness in the family?
Well, it was, if the weather was good, it wasn't hard. But when you had, you're talking about cold winters, a lot of cold weather, rainy weather, it was sometimes hard to get a doctor. We had a number of doctors in the county, but you might go to his home to get him, and he'd be at Pine Swamp somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
You'd have to wait for him.
Out on a call.
Out on the call.
Well, can you remember any herb medicines that were used back in those days for family cures and things like that? Would you mind to tell us something about those?
Well, you had to have bone set. You couldn't get you couldn't get through the winter without that, the old folks thought. That was one of the main ones.
What did it do, Mr. Colvard?
Well, it tastes like quinine.
Uh-huh.
It kind of took the place of quinine to an extent. And it looked like you're going to maybe a kid who's going to get down with bad cold fever, why they throw it in bed and start throwing the bone set tea to him.
Yeah, it's kind of a cure-all.
Kind of a cure-all. They thought it was a cure-all.
I've heard of a sassafras tea. What?
Sassafras tea. They used a lot of sassafras tea. I don't remember just what it was used for. One thing they did use a lot of was asafoetida.
Asafoetida.
Oh yeah, it is
Was
a cure.
that the thing that you put around your neck?
That's right. It is a cure-all.
And was that pretty widely used?
Widely used.
Yeah.
Asafoetida was.
Can you remember any of the other herbs that they
Well, they used the bloodroot and sarsaparilla, several other herbs.
I'm unclear. Was your grandfather in the Civil War?
My grandfather was, well, from the first to the last. He got wounded twice.
And what was his name?
Witherspoon.
Witherspoon.
They're both Witherspoon.
I've heard them talk about a Witherspoon in the UDC, and some of the Witherspoons even in the DAR.
Yeah.
Do you remember any particular tales that he told when you were growing up that you would wish to recall?
Well, I've heard him tell a lot of them, but I don't remember so many of them. I remember one thing he told me. I was telling someone the other day about that. Something came up. He said, "Never be afraid of a dead man. He won't hurt you.
That's right. Well, that's
But watch the live one."
Yeah, that's the ones you have to watch.
Yeah.
You sometimes wish that since we have to have wars, or do have wars, that it was as simple now as it was back then, and our country wouldn't be as endangered with these missiles and things that we have facing us today.
Yes, it is much better in that respect. I'm kind of like Harry Truman, though, on the nuclear war. He said we'd never have one. It was so dangerous.
So dangerous,
it
so
was
terrible.
Yeah, so dangerous it was safe.
Well, we certainly hope we never will. Mr. Fred, do you have any interesting things that you'd like to tell us about your school years, about where you attended school and so forth?
Well, I attended school, most all my schooling was here at Orion, and we had an enrollment of about 65 children. Most of the time, be about 40 of them there. One teacher, and he's teaching everything from the 1st to the 7th grade, so he pretty well had his hands full, didn't he?
He sure did. You had to be pretty well acquainted with all the subjects in order to and the ages and their ability to get the education at that point in time.
Yeah.
Do you remember some of the early school people that you would like to say something about? Professor Plummer or any of the old early
Teachers?
teachers?
Well, I remember one in particular, Emmett Robinson. Do you ever know of Emmett?
I've heard of it.
Now, he was a free school teacher, a real one. As he said when he came into our schoolhouse up here, he said, "Now, I don't have many rules. There's another one of you here that doesn't know what you're here for. And we're going to have a smooth school and a quiet school." And we did. They used to say you could hear a pin drop.
Right. He believed where there was discipline, there was learning.
That's right.
Well, that's a good way to look at it. Do you remember any of the social life back in those days? Things such as box suppers and corn huskings and things like
Yes,
that?
they had some. Most all schools had a box supper every fall, and a lot of corn huskings in the country. Used to hide a jug in the middle of the pile.
I'm not being nosy, but how did you meet Miss Nora?
I met her up at they were running a big revival meeting up at Jefferson.
Uh-huh.
I believe Ham was the minister's name. I met her up there.
Uh-huh. Well, that's certainly a good place to make a first acquaintance. I remember back in the early days, one of the first places I remember was a big June meeting out at
Oh, yeah.
Nathan's Creek.
Mm-hmm.
Do you ever remember attending those in the early
Oh,
days?
yes. Yeah, Big June and Rose Creek.
Right. What church are you affiliated with?
Methodist.
Fred? Methodist Church.
Jefferson.
And have you been a Methodist all down through the years, or did you attend some other?
All
Church.
through the years.
Okay.
Yeah.
We getting down to a period in your life now that I know you're a member of Post 171 of the American Legion and World War I veterans. When did you first go in the service, Mr. Fred?
I believe it was October the 2nd, 1917.
October 2nd, 1917. And where were you stationed during the war?
Well, I was stationed at Camp Jackson for several months, then at Greenville, and then I believe they sent our outfit then to Camp Gordon, Georgia.
Uh-huh.
And I was discharged from Camp Gordon. I never went across. I got in replacement work.
What?
They put me in replacement work after I finished officers training school. I was second lieutenant, and I wouldn't have gone over yet for a couple of months.
Mm-hmm. Well, I've always said that a good soldier went where he was sent, and that's where they sent you.
Yeah, but
you've always
they
been
sent me.
a good soldier, and we certainly appreciate your membership in the veterans organizations. Is there any particular incident that in this period that you'd like to tell us about? Did you ever know our well-known person about West Jefferson, Pine Medley, back in those days?
Oh, yeah.
Is there anything you'd want to say about Pine?
Well, Pine, and won't be another Pine. He was a corker.
Maybe you know a little incident about him that you could relate.
Well, I tell this once in a while about him selling Bill Reeves a cow. Will was up at the market one day, that's not been many years ago, looking for a milk cow. Pine got on to it. He said, "Mr. Reeves, I have a cow that'll suit you, I believe." He says, "Well, how much milk should you give, Pine?" 2 gallons of the milk, and Pine says. "And you can come and see her milked. Come up in the morning and see us milk her." Well, he looked at the cow, and he liked the cow, and he went up to see her milked. And she gave the 2 gallons. But the next morning when he milked her, he didn't get enough for his coffee. So he went back on Pine. Pine told him, "Now, Mr. Reeves, all people we don't all milk alike. Baby don't milk like we milk. We just milk every other day."
That's reason enough, isn't it?
Yeah, that's reason enough.
I thought maybe you were going to say, but she's a good old cow. She'll give you all she's got. Mr. Fred, over the years, I guess a lot of people have been inspired by the things you do here in the county.
Well, I don't know.
I know it's probably one of the reasons that I decided to go into agriculture. I lived on a little farm and couldn't do a good job farming, or didn't. And I always liked the way you farmed, and therefore I wanted to learn more about it. I feel like there's been a lot of people here in the state that have benefited from that knowledge that you've given over the years, and you certainly have one of the prettiest settings for a farm of any place that I've been. What have you noticed about the agriculture of Ashe County over the years? How it's changed from the early days?
Well, it's changed a lot from the early days. In the early days, every farm, they try to be as near self-sufficient as they could, see? And they'd have wheat and rye and buckwheat, finding on about every farm. And something they had to have to go along on, live on. Well, that's one of the biggest things I notice. You don't see much of that anymore. They buy the flour at the store.
Right.
And so on. It made a great difference too in the wildlife, some of the quail, and so particularly the quail. They had so much food back then, you know, following the grain crops, you know, and good cover. But we don't have that anymore, and we don't have the quail.
What all type grains have you grown on your farm during the years?
Well, in the grain, it's been wheat and oats and rye, corn, of course. And as I say, back in the early days, every farm nearly had a bit of that. It's about all of them had to have.
I understand that you had one of the first grist mills that was water powered too back in those days. Is that right?
Well, yeah, we have one here, but that mill was established, it was built in about 1825.
1825.
By my grandfather on my grandmother's side, my dad's side, Absalom Bauer. He built this one over here at Lynchwood in 1825. And then he had different mills around. He was a wheelwright, millwright.
How late did that operate? I mean, how long over the period?
It's still
of time?
operating.
Still operating.
Yeah, been operating practically all the time since it was first put in.
Well, that is remarkable. Can you give us a little idea of some of the crops, different crops that you've enjoyed growing over the years, just to show the scope of what you've done here on this farm?
Well, I expect the potatoes and cabbage have, you know, been our biggest crop that we've been growing for the last 50 years now. And I like to see them both grow, like to grow them. Over a period of years, they'll make you a little money. May miss this year. You know how it goes.
Yeah, there's no way of telling the market.
Hit next year, yeah. But through the years, it balances out pretty good.
I remember some years ago you had a peach orchard up on the face of the mountain. Could you tell us something about that?
Well, there were bare up there. We had peaches every year practically, but they came on in a rainy season in August usually when they'd get ripe, and they just didn't have any flavor.
Mm-hmm.
Nice peaches. They had no taste to them until you boiled them, until you cooked them. Now you cooked them, got the moisture out of them, they get that sweetness back. But you couldn't tell a man that and sell him peaches. He wanted them to taste good. When like Harry Coons told me, Harry put it pretty well on that. He says, Fred, I went up to the orchard last week and I killed myself eating peaches, hunting the good ones.
That's pretty good. Of course, we don't get as much hot, dry weather as they do down in Georgia.
No.
and in the sand hills.
No.
I remember another crop that was grown here that probably isn't grown too much anymore was gladolias.
Yes, we grew flowers a number of years back we started back in the 30s with the Vaughan Seed Company and had out several acres of gladiolas for the bulbs.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't want you to cut the flower. They wanted the strength of it to go to the bulb, and had a lot of varieties. Then later I went in with this man from Florida, Woolfolk. You may have met him.
I remember him.
And we grew flowers a number of years together. And he was a real flower man. He lived flowers. We had the king asters mainly, and some glads, gypsophilia, different flowers. And he knew how to grow them, how to pack them. And he died then, and I quit. I didn't have anyone else to equal him looking after him. I tried it 1-2 years with some of the boys who had worked with him.
Mm-hmm.
But didn't go along like Woolfolk, and I quit.
Well,
I like to grow them.
they were beautiful as I remember them, and it's like I've told some people about flowers in this country. We evidently have a good mixture of soil and minerals that gives them a beautiful color.
Yeah,
And I think that is true with some of the vegetables. It gives them a better flavor.
it does, no question about it.
We're God blessed in that sense, in that we do have good soil and climate for certain crops.
Yeah.
A few years ago, I remember, were one of the biggest strawberry growers in the county too. Could you tell me something about your...
Well, we grew strawberries for a number of years, about 20 acres a year. Wages got up to the point where you couldn't handle them. You couldn't grow them and make anything. We did very well for a number of years there on strawberries. And I like to grow strawberries. They have a good flavor too, as you say. But wages kept mounting until there's too much hand labor in them. Good family crop yet, though.
Right, where you have plenty of your own labor.
That's right.
It would be a good crop to
Good family
think
crop.
about. I remember too, over the years, you have helped develop several varieties of different vegetables. Could you tell us something about maybe some of the potato varieties?
Well, it was potatoes chiefly. I worked with the state on those for 20 years. And they made a lot of crosses, but never released but 2 or 3 of them, the Boone and the Sequoia mainly. And it's still grown a lot in some places, but not many around here anymore. But it's a great yielding potato.
Your main variety now is what, Mr. Fred?
Right now we're growing mostly reds, Norland, red Norland.
They're more early. They are
Early,
potato.
early.
You have grown Kennebecks too.
Oh yeah, we've grown Kennebecks, growing some Kennebecks this year, about 10 acres.
Your cabbage project, I remember everybody said that you could grow the best cabbage of anyone in the
We did
country,
have
too.
good cabbage. Not bragging, but we had good cabbage.
And your market was with,
Market was good.
did you sell mostly to wholesalers or
Yeah.
retail stores?
Most of the wholesalers. Most of the wholesalers.
Do you want to tell us about some of your best varieties of cabbage? What did you find was one of your standbys?
Well, once we grew more Oakview than anything else.
That was
But
a
this-
real tight head, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was a fine head, but a tight head, heavy head, and had a good color. But they're pretty well gone out of the picture now. They brought in new varieties. A lot of new varieties. A lot of them good, too.
And recently, Mr. Fred, you've been in the Christmas tree business. Could you tell us something about that?
Well, it's like all other crops. It will make you some money, one year with another. And I don't think a time will come that you can't sell a fancy tree, a good tree. But the time's already passed when you can sell any kind of a tree. You just can't do it for any money. I like to grow them. It's a long crop. It's a long crop unless till your first ones come in. If you keep setting every year, you don't notice it so much, you see.
Right.
But it's a long time from the first setting till they go to cutting. About 8 years. And then it'll take about 3 years to clean the field off.
You're talking about cleaning a field off. I remember back in the early days when we'd go in and clean land off and call them new grounds. How much? Of course, you grew up on this farm, and it's probably pretty well developed.
A lot of it was.
Excuse me.
I can remember when quite a bit of it was cleared. Good timber.
And what were your main crops back in those very earliest days now we're talking about?
Well, it was corn and wheat in the very earliest days. Rye. You grow a crop of rye where nothing else much would grow, you know.
Of course, you used a lot of rye and wheat for cover crops,
Right.
and I can remember the days of
Yeah.
the thrashers, and of course,
Oh, yeah.
you had probably had those with you for days here on this size farm.
We sure did.
I can remember some of the best meals we ever had is when my mother would cook for the thrashers.
Oh, yeah.
I'm sure
Yeah.
that everybody looked forward to coming here and eating some of Miss Nora's good dinners that she'd put on the table when they'd have the thrashers.
Yep.
Again, I want to say that I really appreciate the time that you've taken to give us on this interview, and to say that we appreciate everything that you've done for the people of Ashe County. I know that I can remember back during the Depression, if a person couldn't get work anywhere else, somebody would suggest, well, let's go to Mr. Fred's and see if he's got work to do. Can you tell us anything about the Depression days?
I sure can. They were tough days.
Just tell us some of the things that you remember about. Probably the younger people couldn't believe what I would tell them, but I know that they know that you're creditable and will tell the truth. So, what kind of wages did we have back in those days?
Back in those days, 75 cents per day.
Per day. And
75 cents per day, and you couldn't hire much at that. I mean, you just didn't have the money to pay for it. People didn't have the money. You get the help. You get, as they say, you wouldn't say work. Fella come and ask you. He won't say you can have some work I can do. He says, okay, you need any help? So it was 75 cents a day. One thing a fella could hardly believe, I kept a close account. In the toughest days there, we had 3 children, and I kept a record of everything we spent, even to a nickel's worth of candy. And we were living on about $340 a year.
$340 a year.
Mm-hmm.
Well, those days really taught you how to manage what little money you had, and your clothes too. I can remember wearing patches.
Oh yes, hello yes. Wearing patches is right. Yeah, 340. I've got it hung right around that for a number of years. Of course, we made a lot on the garden and so forth. We lived at home, as the saying is.
Well, I would like to say this. We'd like to come back at a later date and maybe get you and Miss Nora together and to have a good interview here in the county over the years. Is there anything you want to tell us in closing?
Not anything, I guess. Maybe another time, yeah.
Well, we certainly appreciate it, Mr. Fred.
I'm glad you came around.
Thank you very much.